Hello, I'm Christopher Davis, and today I'm going to talk about the roles of assessment in competency-based education. This presentation is specifically intended for the veterinary medicine department at Michigan State University, but if someone else happens to find this on the vast web of the internet, please feel free to use it as you see fit. So in the agenda today, we're going to talk about multiple roles of assessment in CBE, right? That's competency-based education. And after we do that, we're going to clarify, or as we do that, we're going to clarify some important definitions. These two are really important. This idea of assessment versus evaluation and a competency versus an outcome. So hopefully as we clarify those definitions, that'll give us some information about how assessment has a role in competency-based education. After we look at those definitions, connect them to the roles of assessment, I'm going to showcase three models of assessment in CBE, and two of them I've developed to enhance the understanding of this program, and one of them is from Mary Allen's excellent book, Assessing Academic Programs in Higher Education. It's a little green book published in 2004 that I highly recommend to anyone interested in assessing academic programs for higher ed. At the end, I'm going to very quickly propose some possible future presentations that might build on this presentation. This is a very theoretical presentation, and I'm going to talk about what some more practice-oriented presentations might look like right at the end here. Okay, so let's move right on into the presentation and start with some assumptions. And the first one here is that when I talk about assessment, I'm going to talk about student learning assessment. There are, of course, many types of assessment. I just mentioned program assessment, but when I say assessment generally, I'm talking about student learning assessment. And if I am talking about something else, I will let you know as we move through the presentation. I'm also assuming some knowledge of the basic terms surrounding pedagogy, andragogy, CBE assessment, these sorts of things. If for some reason I use a term that is unclear or needs more definition, please let me know, and I will be happy to add a note to this YouTube video or get in contact with you. Let you know, just go ahead and send me an email. And finally, when we're talking about CBE specifically, I'm going to make an assumption that a lot of CBE makes, and that's that both students and instructors are really bought into this notion of this competency-based education. I'm just going to let you know, this is a really common critique of CBE and lots of andragogy, is that it really overestimates student buy-in when making decisions, right? We assume that students will be doing all these things because they're totally engaged in their learning, when in fact we have adult learners who have many demands on their time, and school may not be priority number 1 or 2, it may be priority number 3. But let's assume for the purposes of this presentation that the things we're talking about are possible, and students and instructors are very much bought into these notions, okay? So with that in mind, I'm a big believer in active learning, and I could sit here and talk for a substantial length of time. Anyone who knows me will vouch for that fact, but let's start out with a little bit of an active learning activity, and let's brainstorm. So I would encourage you just to brainstorm some answers to this question. What are the roles of assessment in competency-based education? Go ahead and try and come up with at least 3 answers, but if you don't know, go ahead and write I don't know if you can't come up with a second or third one. If you need to, pause this video for a few seconds and try and jot down at least 3 roles of assessment in CBE. Okay, so I'm going to assume that you have paused and have those written down, and keep those near you because we'll return to them later. So the first definition kind of thing I want to introduce is this idea of transparency in teaching. Transparency in teaching is pretty much exactly what it refers to, right? In CBE, we want no mysteries and no surprises. Everything that we do should be obvious that we're doing it for a reason, right? The difference is that when we be transparent with our teaching, students should really do a much better job of knowing when they are succeeding and when they are struggling. And this all connects to learning, right? It's all driven by learning. Succeeding and struggling are modified by this term learning. Succeeding means learning lots. Struggling means learning little. And students need to know that, okay? So what I have popping up on the right side of the screen here is a stamp, and I'm going to put these stamps at a couple of various places in the presentation to say, hey, here's a role of assessment to tell students when they're succeeding and when they're struggling. Basically, because students should know when they're learning. Assessment in CBE should be doing that for you. To return to this idea of transparency in teaching, though, we're not just talking about transparency of an assessment result. It's not just if you got a high score on this assessment, you're doing well. If you have a low score on this assessment, you're doing poorly. We're talking about that connection to the instruction and the learning. Okay, so this assessment, if you have a low score, it should say something to that student about how they've been instructed or what they've learned. Okay, it should tell them about the effectiveness of those educational opportunities. Now, it doesn't say where things went right or where things went wrong. And in a sense, we may not need to know all that information. As program planners, it'd be really useful to make some of those things later. But what a student needs to know is that, okay, I've sat in this class, I'm not getting it, I need to go back to a different type of instruction. I need to work on my learning. We should be really transparent about what our teaching is supposed to be doing, and that should connect really directly to what's being assessed. As a just informal research thing, I asked a class of 26 students what their frustrations were with testing and what they thought a bad test was. And n equals 21 of 26 in their top 3 things managed to respond something to the effect of, when something's on the test that I didn't expect to be on the test. Like I said, in CBE, no mysteries, no surprises. Very transparent about what we're teaching, what the students should be learning, and that should all come through an assessment. Here's me putting my money where my mouth is. So let's be transparent in my teaching. Why did I have that last slide that asked you to do that brainstorming exercise? What was the point? I'm modeling. And what I'm modeling is the importance of a baseline. So modeling is a teaching technique, right? And I'm making that transparent to you. The baseline is the objective that I want you to learn about, right? So I want to try and teach you about baselines by modeling. And what a baseline does is it tells you change. You're establishing what you knew at the start, and then we're going to look at it at the end and see what you've changed, right? So here we go. Here's the second role of assessment. It lets you baseline things. Baselining is hugely important for CBE. I would actually argue you can't do CBE unless you baseline well. So moving on to our next set of definitions. This is what I sort of forecasted in the agenda slide, and this is a really key one, is this difference between assessment and evaluation. If you were to make a guess at these two, go ahead and pause the screen now. Make a guess as to the difference between assessment and evaluation. Okay, and if you've got your guess or you've written it down in front of you, if you don't know, go ahead and write I don't know, because again, that gives us a baseline. That tells us something about current knowledge levels, right? And I see these terms used interchangeably a lot. For practical reasons, that may be okay, but I would encourage you to try and distinguish them in your head, because I think they'll help you get better at both. What I'm not going to tell you is that one's useful and one's not. I think they're both useful, and they both definitely have a purpose. But I think they both become less useful when you start confusing their purposes. So I define assessment as something that gives us information, right? Whereas an evaluation makes a judgment based on some value. There's a value right in the middle of that word. Assessment's a little bit purer academically in this sense, but evaluations tend to be what we care about. We are, in the real world, often outside of our academic context, purely just concerned with the information. We want to know what that information tells us. So if they're both important, why I'm asking you to make this distinction. Well, like I said at the start, I do think it's important that you'll be better at both if you do clearly say, okay, I am trying to make some judgments based on values, or no, I'm just trying to gather information. I think you'll write better tests, which is a little bit of a psychometric problem there. But I also want to give you this framework for me, which is I tend to prefer to think through what's the information first before moving to what can I do with that information, as opposed to immediately going towards what judgments do I make about students and teaching. When you make those judgments early, when you add evaluation into an assessment early, I think you often corrupt your data. You impose a model on it, you impose some sort of lens on it that may not exist in the world of pure data. If you have an important theoretical or philosophical reason for doing that, that's great, but I would also count that as some sort of information, okay? To kind of continue this idea, evaluation really judges the past, and you want to criticize past performance. This is a really important thing to do, right? You need to criticize past performance because you're trying to predict future performance, and we can't follow students throughout their careers. At some point, we're going to need to make these value judgments, okay? As opposed to that, assessment is an analysis. It's an analyzing process, and you're going to identify these spots where the gaps in learning occur. You're less concerned with evaluating the student's learning, but identifying spots where the gaps are. So if I was to take a pool of students and say, they all have 3 gaps, find them, that's very different than going, here's a pool of 20 students, judge which ones have too many gaps to pass, okay? That lens, I think, will help you write slightly purer assessments, and then when the time comes to evaluate, the judgments will be based on clearer information. Assessment also charts this path for the future, which is quite different than trying to predict future performance, okay? So this analysis of the past is going to help us decide what we should do in the future, as opposed to that judgmental situation that says, because of this in the past, this is what I think you will do in the future. So an assessment's often going to help us cover those gaps, whereas evaluation may more judge those gaps as good or bad. As I type this up, these questions pops to mind, which is, so given that definition, isn't assessment just, in CBE, just traditional formative assessment? And I would say it isn't, and here's the reason why. Traditional formative assessment says, what will the teacher do? All right, so here you go. You've got 5 papers. These are scores. They're on a scale from 0 to 100. What are you going to do? I think most teachers are going to say there's a problem here, right? Maybe we have a median score of 60. A median score of 60 is not great. We definitely have some students who are really struggling. Maybe I should reteach. But the emphasis in that sentence is on the I, okay? It's about the teacher. What should the teacher do? Good formative assessment really does that. But in CBE, you're going to kind of look at, well, this is something the teacher might do, but it also gives us information about what the students might want to do. Back to the idea of transparency in teaching, why would you ever run an assessment without giving students the results? Students need those results so they can be accountable for their own learning and take some of that into their own hands. So here we go. Here's a similar set of scores that you might see on some sort of CBE assessment. You've got a couple of novices, an intermediate, and a master. Okay? So an assessment might recognize that different students here are looking for different learning opportunities, and we're going to direct them towards that, right? This is a really key idea to CBE. It's a very important role of assessment, to be able to look at these results, and instead of trying to aim towards the middle and shift the whole class in the appropriate direction, instead, we're aiming for each specific student to move towards the learning opportunity that makes sense for that student. That's a big difference between traditional form of assessment, and the difference is the switch or the addition of that student focus instead of just what can the teacher do. I do want to make this other distinction, okay? And that's when we assess in CBE, we're based only on competencies, and we're based on very specific competencies. So you can't assess that in a way that includes distractors. The common example is grammar, okay? If I have students in a science class and a student turns in a paper that demonstrates a clear understanding of all the ideas, but very, very poor grammar scores, grammatical understanding of the rules, there are certain teachers that would say that's a problem. In CBE, it's not. If the ideas are there, and that's what you're demonstrating understanding of, that's what the competency is about, these scientific ideas, whatever they might be, then you can't change the student's score on the assessment based on a distractor that's not the competency. Okay? So that's going to be very important when you talk about like pure data. Of course, I say this, and this is going to lead me into the second set of the definitions, which is, okay, so great, what's a competency? I want to start this off with the other way. So what I'd like you to do is pause the video and simply answer this question, which is, what is not a competency? And please write me an example, or 3 or 4 or 5, if you can. So what I'd specifically like you to think about are things that you might have heard other people call competencies that you would not consider a competency. So pause the video and do that, or if you'd like us to take some time to discuss it with other people around you, I think that would also be great. Okay, so if you've come back and you've got some examples of what not a competency, I'm going to give you some categories and see if your examples fit into these categories, okay? So the first category are these things that tend to be traditionally categorical variables with 2 scores. Yes, no, 1, 0, pass, no pass. Course objectives, what you call standard in K-12, outcomes, these tend to be very often categorically scored, right? Did you meet the course objective or did you not? Did you meet the standard, did you not? There's a standard in Texas, actually, or there used to be a standard in Texas, they may revise it, but actually had to do with how far a student could throw a football. Their physical education standard, I believe it was 10 feet in 4th grade. There's only one way to score that. Categorical, yes or no. The standard is written in such a way that either a student passes it or they do not. So this is not a competency. So if I'm telling you competencies are not categorically scored, well, the answer then obviously is that they're going to be continuously scored, or they're continuous variables. But I also want to make this other point that competencies are not grades. Just like I mentioned at the end of the last slide, there's lots of things that might go into a grade. Another common example, along with the grammar example, is late work. If a student is 2 days late and gets 20 points subtracted from some sort of test, that does not indicate that there are 20 points less on the competency, unless of course your competency was tardiness. But we need to be very careful that when we're talking about competencies, we're not conflating that with these terms, objective, standards, outcomes, and grades. So competencies are things that measure latent traits, and without going into a whole lot of explanation of what a latent trait is, I'm going to tell you latent traits are continuous variables. There are things that exist inside a person that range from a whole spectrum all the way from complete mastery, far better than any human can do right now, to complete and utter abject uselessness. And we can make them categorical in order to interpret them, but the trait itself is continuous, right? There's a nearly infinite number of segments we could break it into. We're going to break it into like 5 or 7 because that's useful to us. But the trait itself is continuous, okay? So Competencies are these continuous variables. Assessment estimates them. It guesses. You do an assessment, it guesses at your score on a competency. So with that in mind, I want you to think through this idea of outcomes versus competencies, right? So let's talk about multiplication skill. It ranges from low to high. Here is 1 point on that scale, right? We're going to say in 4th grade math about students can multiply 2-digit numbers with 1-digit numbers to find 2- and 3-digit products. Here's another point on that scale, much closer to the high end. Multiplication of matrices for use in polynomial regression. Graduate statistics, maybe. Undergraduate statistics, possibly. So what I want you to do is go, all right, so is multiplication skill and this long continuum the outcome or the competency? Conversely, this 2 things at the bottom here, are these outcomes or competencies? Just go ahead and take a guess, write down your labels. So, like I said before, these are outcomes at the bottom. These are pretty much things that students either can or cannot do. Very, very important. But what we're interested in CBE, obviously, is the competency. We're trying to guess, is a student at this point on the scale, this point on the scale, much higher? Where is a student's knowledge on this idea of multiplication skill? Again, there are forms of multiplication that I'm sure have not even been invented yet. They're way off to this side. And then there are some people who don't even have like the prerequisite skills, like addition, to be able to do multiplication. Okay, so they're way down here. This nearly infinite scale, that makes this a competency. CBE, competency-based education, is all about people's movement along this continuum. Assessment is how you make a guess at where a student is and how much a student's changing due to your educational intervention. Assessment is not for going, did a student achieve or did not achieve an outcome. Okay? That's key. You can do that with a test, but if you're trying to judge a yes or no on an outcome, you're probably not looking at an assessment. You're looking at an evaluation. That's a value judgment. Can you do it or can you not? Assessment are making this guess, giving you information about where a student is on a competency scale. So there you go. There's your role of assessment. This is an important distinction. I'm going to offer you the opportunity to practice here. This is very short, but if you want to blip through it, that's absolutely okay. So if we're going to practice this idea of outcome or competency, I'm just going to put 4 of them up here and say, hey, please choose. What do you think? Which one's an outcome? Which one's a competency? All right, and if you chose the bookends as your outcomes and the ones in the middle as your competencies, you're absolutely correct. Those 2 in the middle are going to be continuous variables, and those 2 on the outsides are going to be dichotomous categorical variables, right? And that's kind of the easiest way to tell the difference. So as we saw in this previous slide, though, competencies tend to have many outcomes, theoretically an infinite number, but usually a manageable number, 5 to 7, that we're interested in, right? And they range from low to high. So what I'd like you to do is choose a competency and write at least 5 levels of outcomes for that competency. Try and relate these to some actual student behaviors you have observed in the past, and then once you have them, pair and share with somebody else. Okay, so see what they thought. Just a little note here on statistics, 5 levels of outcome offers up some statistical methodologies that make this easier to do. 5 will work, 7 is preferred. For right now, I would say look at some competency, try and write 5 levels of outcomes. Okay. And if you've got that and you finish your pair and share, then what I'd like you to do next is secretly choose a different competency and write down some outcomes for it. Then have your partner try and guess the competency. Okay? And if you really want to push this to the next level, scramble up the outcomes, see if your partner can arrange them in order from low to high. Hopefully what this does is give you some good feedback on the clarity of your outcomes. If you'd like to pause the video at this point and try that exercise, I highly encourage it. So as we've looked at this distinction, we've practiced it, I always love to ask this question when I'm teaching anything, which is, why does this matter? Why would I bother putting these slides on this presentation? And if you'd like to answer this question on yourself, please do. Go ahead and pause the video and do so. What I'm going to tell you is that it's important to think of your competency as continuous, because this frees you up to think of your outcomes as a minimum. Okay, so these things are continuous. They range from negative infinity to infinity, or 0 to infinity, depending on your variable, right? But your outcome's likely a minimum. So how does that help? If you have other people in the room, this might be a good chance for some large-scale discussion to say, how does it help you to think of your outcomes as a minimum? I'm going to offer two reasons, and the first one is kind of something that we've seen in K-12 as sort of a negative effect of a lot of the standards-based education, and that's that we spend so much time focusing on getting students up to a minimum that we tend to ignore the students who have already reached that minimum. And if you're planning a program, you need to have things for students to do that go far beyond that minimum level of achievement. This kind of leads to the second point, which is this idea of andragoging lifelong learning. Adult learners, especially learners who are looking at a career path, are not just interested in hitting that minimum and then being done with it forever. We want them to keep improving. There's something beyond that minimum, right? But if you think of your outcome as a minimum, that's going to allow you to help direct those learners towards enhancing their learning after they leave their time with you. Okay? Another important idea is it's important to distinguish between outcomes and competencies when we're evaluating our competencies, and this is where I will talk a little bit of program assessment. It's really easy to write outcomes, but it's really difficult to know if we have chosen a good competency, because the metric of competency is importance. Good competencies are important. However, it's really hard to tell what something is important or not. And I don't have a great solution here, other than to tell you that through dialogue and discipline-specific expertise and connection to practice, that you need to do some time figuring out which of your competencies are important. The only metric I can tell you is that good, important competencies are competencies that students will use a lot. This is going to free you up, actually, and that's going to lead me to a really important point I want to make about assessment. So to return to this idea of assessment, student learning assessment now, let's talk about the stakes in assessment in CBE. And in traditional testing, as the importance of the test goes up, so do the stakes of the test. The importance of the outcome that you're looking at. The stakes of the test go way up. This causes anxiety in students. Highly important things, high stakes testing. Right? That's actually become like a lexicon phrase. In CBE, the opposite is true. Okay? So as the importance of the outcome goes up, the stakes actually go down. Why is this? This seems great for students, but why is this? This is because if we're planning competencies, the most important ones are going to have many opportunities for students to learn them. Poor assessment results are okay. It's absolutely fine, because the students are going to have many, many opportunities to learn them. something that a student may only have one opportunity to learn, a poor assessment result is much more worrying because now they have no way to actually learn that content. This causes a little problem in program planning because that means the more important your competencies are, the more learning opportunities you have to plan for them. That's why on the previous slide I said you have to do some time figuring out which are the most important competencies. So there you go again, like I said, the higher the importance of a competency in CBE, actually the lower the stakes. Provided, like I said, your program provides many opportunities for those high importance competencies to be learned. So I'm going to do a quick check for understanding, and I want to start with this idea of a metaphor for assessment in CBE. This is kind of a fun exercise, and please relate assessment in CBE to a food or a tornado or something crazy. And the reason I want you to do this is because as we've looked through these definitions, I've thrown some stamps up there to talk about different roles of assessment. Hopefully I've enhanced your understanding. Hopefully we've proceeded from that baseline. And a metaphor demonstrates understanding, right? Good metaphors enhance understanding. But go ahead, make a metaphor. Assessment's like a diamond, the assessment's like a sandwich, whatever you want. So here's one for me. Assessment in CBE is like the yellow brick road in Oz. There are many interesting things to see on all sides of the path, but it keeps us moving towards our goal when we get distracted by those things on the sides of the path. If we're really off target, assessment's going to move us back towards what's important, right? Keep us going towards that goal. If you agree with this or disagree with this, take some time, have a conversation about that. Talk through the rest of your metaphors and see if they help enhance your understanding. So here might be a good place to take a little bit of a break, but I do want to move into this section on models. So if you need to stand up and take 5 minutes, walk around the room, that's great. But models should do exactly what that metaphor is supposed to do. It should enhance your understanding of the roles of assessment in competency-based education. Before we begin this section, I would really encourage you to develop a model on your own just as an exercise and try and answer one of these 2 questions with your model, which is how do we understand the role of assessment, or how do we make decisions about assessment during the planning process. So a good model will probably help you with one of those 2 things. I'm going to say that good models are parsimonious. Models omit important things in order to better illustrate some of the roles of assessment in CBE. And the goal of this presentation is learning. So what I'm going to present are 3 academic models. They're not decision-making models. And I think that that's really important here. Mary Allen's may be used to make decisions, but I would still argue that it is primarily an academic model. Okay, so I do want to start with a model for the students, right? And this is an idea that I've talked about earlier, but I want to make very clear that the role of assessment is to build CBE curriculum paths, because pure CBE is really a fiction. Some people claim Western Governors University, there's a couple other universities that are doing pure CBE. I still don't think they'll let you walk in, take a test, and walk out with a diploma, even if you have all the necessary skills. And almost all programs have some sort of base courses or some everybody takes subset of courses, okay? So what you're going to do in those is learn, practice, develop the most important competencies, right? But depending upon your assessment results, students supplement learning. This is key because I'm not saying that depending upon program planners' decisions, students supplement their learning. I'm saying that depending upon assessment results, students supplement their learning. That's how assessment builds curriculum paths. So here's my very, very colorful model here. And to walk you through this, the most important thing we have here is this baseline at the start, right? Where we would go ahead and assess all of our competencies. And this model has 3 competencies in it, right? Our green, our orange, and our purple. There's 3 competencies in this model. So the black squares are assessment, and we're going to look at time kind of left to right on all of, well, these first two models. Okay. So students are going to start at this baseline and then kind of move through this way, taking various assessments as they go through. But those assessments are going to chart their path towards these other learning opportunities. And I've just picked 5 kind of generic learning opportunities. These are things you might do. There are, of course, hundreds of things you might put in as learning opportunities. But what students will be doing is looking at the results from those baselines and those subsequent assessments to chart their path through this model, right? So that's fun, and let's try it. So here's our red student here. Their baseline looks like they're a little bit deficient in green, so they're immediately going to pick up that green course. Ooh, and a lot of supplementary green experiences. Oh, they've picked up 2 courses in purple now. They're kind of sketching on orange, but it looks like they're picking up orange later. They finally did get a course in orange. Going to finish up with some strong, looks like a mentored experience in purple before moving on to the next stage of curriculum, right? Moving through those different competencies based on their learner preferences and the results of those assessments. Okay, but let's say we have a second student. This is student blue. Student blue comes from a different place, and his baseline says something very different, which is orange is where the student is deficient. And he really took this to heart. It looks like hitting almost all the orange sequences here. In fact, I think he's nearly missed the purples until he gets to this middle section, but he does end with the course in the purple competency, so hopefully he's also becoming well-rounded. That's going to be important to these later assessments. Okay, so hopefully this view helps you think about how a student might use competency-based assessments to inform their education. This is a really scary model for curriculum planners, because there's all sorts of things in here that are flat out unused. And that means there's no students in their classes or there's experience in things. Well, hopefully you've got a large sample of students and they're all doing things, but isn't this a problem in CBE, right? Like, faculty time is valuable, instructor time is valuable. We want to make sure these things are useful to students. So I'm going to step back a little bit and move away from this idea of curricular pathing as this role of assessment. Look more at the curriculum view, right? So if you're a program planner, this might be a more interesting model. And again, what we have is like this base curriculum that everybody takes and all the competencies are in, moves from left to right through time. The different colors are going to equal some different competencies, just like in the previous model, all right? And this one, I've got circles here and I've got some squares at the bottom, and the circles represent learning opportunities, but the different sizes are estimated participations in that learning opportunity. Now this one doesn't separate the learning opportunity, it doesn't tell us what it is. It may be a course, it may be a mentoring experience, it may be a peer experience, could be study abroad. This model doesn't account for that, but it does tell us something about the participation. So in this completely fictitious curriculum, we again have this baseline and assessment, right, where all competencies are assessed at what we're going to call time 0 here. And given the results of that, or given our experience with our students, our kind of knowledge what those results will be, we're going to expect that all students, nearly all our students, are going to have heavy participation in this blue competency, these learning opportunities right at the start, and more participation in this red sort of competency, the learning opportunities associated with this red competency much later on. Okay? And then, again, as we move through this, we're eventually going to hit this point later on here, where we're going to assess again. Okay, we're going to assess everything. You see this looks very much like the baseline. You almost think of this like a curriculum level pre and post test. People have been encouraging this, so we should just the undergraduates, right? Test them when they enter and test them when they leave. But we want this test to look probably pretty similar to this test, because we do want to see those deltas, those changes. That's important. So let's look at some of the roles of assessment here. Here you've got your baseline model, right? And then here we see our curriculum paths as students take assessments. That lets us dictate what kind of opportunities we offer and how students fit in those opportunities. And then eventually we're going to help our students advance past the outcomes. And then they move to this new set of competencies here. I've used similar colors here on this idea that perhaps the second blue competency builds on this first blue competency, right? And so at time 1, okay, this is time 0, here we have time 1, we're going to expect a certain level of achievement on this competency, or a certain level of that latent trait, because that level is necessary to move into studying this second competency. But again, what we're going to do is do a baseline assessment for our new set of competencies, and then start to add our learning opportunities up here. Right? So hopefully those two models help to kind of visualize this interactive effect between what the students are doing and what assessment tells you. And the real key in CBE is that assessments telling you these things, they're not happening from a pre-planned, top-down driven program. And as we look at Mary Allen's model, she's going to suggest this very top-down model. And there's the objectives, there's the alignments with the opportunities, but it's very linear, it's very easy to read. And I think that's going to be useful for certain points of the program planning process. I'm going to show the model and then offer the modification of it for the CBE purposes, and focus on this different, that assessment rather than planners drives the curricular decisions in CBE. So here's Mary Allen's model, right? And what you have done this left side here, these are course numbers. So you have courses 101, 102, all the way down here. And you have a set of objectives for the program, right? And these I's, P's, and D's refer to when the objective is introduced, when it's practiced, and where the student's expected to demonstrate some level of mastery of that objective. So this is a pretty good framework, right? This is very logical. I specifically, when I see a lot of programs put these together, they just put check marks under these and say that competency is in these sets of courses. And I like this IPD framework because you'll have some students that may need 3, 4, 5, 6 opportunities to practice something. Or you'll have some students that may need 2 or 3 introductory experiences for a given objective. You may want multiple ways to demonstrate objectives. That, I think, is very useful framework to you when you're planning programs. But let's go ahead and adjust it for CBE. So obviously what I've done here is go ahead and change objectives for competencies, and change these courses for all sorts of things that we might be doing with students, right? And these are the types of experiences that happen in competency-based education, but they still kind of do the same thing. They introduce competencies, give us a chance to practice them, and then hopefully they offer us a chance to demonstrate mastery of them. In this one, I think you could have at least P's, maybe not I's, but at least P's come after the D's, where that doesn't really happen in Mary Allen's original model. She tends to only have 1 D per column. Okay. But I'll also propose another role of assessment here, and that's, what if students went ahead and filled this out for their own learning, right? So what if they really took control of that curricular path? What if they said, you know what, I want to practice this in a field setting, or I'd like to be introduced to this concept in a mentoring setting because I'm really intimidated by it, perhaps. That might help you as program planners think about ways to improve the learning opportunities that you make available. So that's 3 models. Hopefully those were useful. And I'm going to conclude the presentation now by asking you to return to what we did at the top, which was that activity with the brainstorming. And I'm going to ask the very same question, right? So what are the most important roles of assessment in CBE? List your 3 and compare them to what you wrote at the start of this presentation. Hopefully we've got some improvement. Hopefully you've learned something or added something, or at least came up with something new to think through. If you've done that, I'm going to offer my answers, and this is not to tell you if your answers are right or not. This is not like, did yours check out with what I think? These are my opinions, and for different people, the different roles of assessment are going to be of different values. But one of the most important things to me is this idea of curriculum pathing for students. And I say that simply because if you aren't using assessment to path your students, you're probably not doing CBE. You may be doing some other curriculum structure. It's probably not competency-based education. That distinction of name may be academic, but I think this curriculum pathing is a very powerful part of CBE, and if it's possible, I encourage it. The second most important thing is informing instruction, and by informing instruction here, what I mean is informing creation of the learning opportunities. I think in a very traditional faculty model, a lot of times learning opportunities are created based on faculty interests. And in a CBE model that integrates assessment well, your learning opportunities will be based on student needs. That's very, very important, and it's going to improve student outcomes. I didn't spend a lot of time dwelling on this idea in the presentation, but I do want to mention connecting different portions of the curriculum. A very, very common critique of both undergraduate and graduate programs is that there are lists of courses that don't come together, or maybe they come together at the end with a dissertation or a thesis or some sort of field experience. But it's very difficult while you're in the courses to figure out how this learning opportunity connects to that learning opportunity. Good assessments will help you do that, and will, again, that transparency and teaching idea, make it apparent to the student what the connections are. And to finally, to end and focus on this idea of students, I really find it very valuable to help students recognize and express their own learning. And if you read educational psychology journals, it's pretty much just assumed that the more metacognition students do, the better their learning is and the better they retain that learning. So the more students have those eureka light bulb moments where they say, I couldn't do this before, and now I can. When they say that, when they physically reflect on their own learning, they internalize it in a way that is of much greater depth and duration than a non-internalized structure that they may have learned something, but by not metacognitively acknowledging it, it's less likely to retain. So that's the end of the presentation, but I did promise this kind of offer, which is, these are some possible future presentations. As I mentioned, this was very theoretical. These were some very intriguing models, I thought, but there's definitely a lot of room to talk about practical and practicing. So what does this look like in competency-based education environments? The first presentation I would suggest is this idea of baseline, remediation, and entry differences. We can't assume with graduate students that they all enter at the same place. In fact, we can probably pretty much assume they don't, which means even though you have some sort of base curriculum, you want to start diversifying learning as early as possible. It's going to lower frustration. It's going to enhance connection to the program, right? So maybe you might get some health outcomes by getting some tracking done earlier. I would also suggest a presentation on this idea of curricular pathing. Obviously, I find this very important, but it needs to be very solidly connected to assessment. It's not easy to do, but if you have that core structure of how you'll path via assessment, I think it actually makes it easier to plan the learning opportunities afterwards. Finally, I'd suggest something about how you actually do outcomes assessment in multiple modes. By multiple modes, I mean there's a lot of ways to write a test other than essay questions and multiple choice, right? We can observe people, we can grade all sorts of rubrics, we can run simulations. And as I mentioned, one of the hardest parts of this entire idea of competency-based education is that any assessment is a guess at a score on some latent trait, on some competency. As we know from research, I'll borrow a term from qualitative methodologies, triangulation simply means gain multiple points of data that hopefully tell you the same thing. You have a much better estimate if you have multiple points of data. And the way you do that is multimodal outcomes assessment. People will make reasonable objections that as you choose modes, you're not actually assessing the same thing. I will come down on the side that with clear and consistent rubrics, you can be estimating the same thing in multiple modes, but do realize that that is a substantial debate. Aside from these practical presentations, it'd probably be useful to talk a little bit about measurement assessment, especially to non-audience of faculty. Everyone's going to be familiar with reliability and validity, but importance is much more difficult. And if you're measuring something, measuring how important it is, assessing the important things is incredibly key to CBE. So I would definitely suggest thinking over that. And finally, moving away from student learning assessment to talk about program assessment. There's a couple dimensions here. The first one is goals versus scores. And I don't know how often I've sat in a presentation where someone has talked about their program and they said, our goal was to change the undergraduate experience, and the way we know that is we had X number of people attend our training. And if your scores don't match your goals, it's going to be very, very difficult to adjust your program in meaningful ways. Alongside that, this whole idea of adjusting your program in meaningful ways is closing the loop. So I would really suggest from the earliest stages, building in significant, important ways to use assessment results to change your program. This is purely advice, but again, my favorite statistic is from Trudy Bant and Linda Susky's article in Change magazine in 2010 that says that among programs of good practice in higher education, only 6% can actually show student learning improvement. And that's the reason we do all of this. We're trying to improve student learning. The way you do that, you close the loop. And closing the loop means using your assessment results to adjust your program. The advice I would give from the earliest stage is to build in ways to make sure that happens. So that's some ideas to keep in mind for the future. I hope this was useful to you. I know it's quite a bit long, but if you stuck with this throughout the whole idea, thank you and have a fantastic day. Please let me know if you have any questions.